Hi, everyone. This is another lecture regarding Chapter 3 that looks at family discourse and identity. This lecture is specifically focusing in on family stories. The main objectives for today include examining family stories by looking at the content that's often involved with this particular type of family discourse, as well as looking at the functions or the purpose that family stories serve. I'm just starting by providing you with a quick definition of family stories. I really like this particular definition. It suggests that family stories are verbal accounts of personal experiences that are important to the family and typically involve the creation and maintenance of relationships, depict rules of interaction, and reflect beliefs about family and other social institutions. So I think this definition is just a really good definition that incorporates a lot of really important components of why family stories are so valuable and can be so meaningful and such an important part of family interaction. Of course, family stories can be about anything, and I'm hoping that while you were reading the chapter and also now while you're reading or listening to these lecture slides, you're thinking about some of the family stories that you and your family members share. Maybe you're even thinking about some of those stories that are told over and over again every time you get together. Hopefully you're kind of thinking about, well, why do some stories just simply get retold and retold? What is it about those stories that seem to be important to your family? But while you're doing that, you'll probably notice that most families have some kind of common themes regarding the stories that get told. And so you can see on this slide, there are 4 really common types of family stories. The first one there is called courtship or dating, right? So stories about how people met and how romantic relationships were formed. The second story that's really popular is birth stories. So the story of your birth, and as I'm going through these, I guess I could say this at the end of the list, but let me go ahead and point out that it would be really interesting to ask some of your family members, if you're not already familiar with some of these types of stories, if they'd be willing to share those with you, right? If we were meeting face to face, we would take some time to do that. In fact, as soon as I am thinking about birth stories, I'm reminded of a student who once shared a story that I thought was so interesting. It was about her birth, I guess, technically, but it was also just about her name and where her name came from. She was the oldest sibling in a family of 4, and so when her parents were headed to the hospital when she was about to be born, their first child, they really had not picked out a name yet. And as they were on their way to the hospital, they noticed a sign and they loved the street sign and the name. And so that's how she got her name from the street sign on the way to the hospital. Her name was Sherry. And it turns out that her parents kind of liked that so much that with the 3 remaining siblings, they did the same thing. They never had a name picked out until they were on their way to the hospital. And all 4 children in that family were named after street signs that their parents saw on their way to their delivery. So anyway, that's pretty creative. I don't know if the story of your birth is quite that creative, but if you don't already know it, it would be interesting to ask about that. Okay, the third type of story that's really common within families are survival stories. And then the fourth type of really common stories of being on the margins. Or in other words, some type of stories that talk about when you or when your family members were perhaps considered black sheep or in some way were marginalized or thought less of, and how your family members overcame that. Right? So again, not all stories certainly fit into these categories, but these are some of the very most popular types of stories that most families seem to share. So think about those. Maybe that can generate some interesting conversation within some of your family interactions if you haven't already discussed some of these. Now, in addition to looking at the content of stories, I think your chapter does a really good job of also pointing out how important it is to think about the process of storytelling, right? Sometimes how stories are told are every bit as informative and is every bit as important as what the content of the actual story is, right? In fact, a researcher named John Gottman, who we're going to read a lot more about when we move into our romantic relationships units, but if you're interested, you can go ahead and look at it and look into him now. John Gottman has done a lot of research that looks at how couples tell stories, and he has been able to predict really very accurately whether or not couples will stay together simply based on how they tell the story of the origins of their relationship, right? And so the storytelling process itself can be quite telling and can have an awfully lot of implications. Um, when you're looking at the process of telling stories, one way that we can describe that is through narrative interaction, right? Or again, how people are telling the story. Specific components of narrative interaction include engagement, which has to do with how involved or warm or what the interaction between the people telling the story, what that looks like. Turn taking is also a part of narrative interaction, as well as perspective taking or coordination. In what ways do the two sides of the story, in what ways do they match, and do the people kind of agree, or is the story kind of lopsided or one-sided, right? My guess is when you're thinking about this, you can, or I hope you can, maybe picture even some of your family members or maybe just some of your friends telling stories, and picture them telling that story, what it looks like, right? Pretty easily I can think of just some friends, and I can think of some couples where I've watched them tell stories, and as I've watched them, I've noticed that they tend to be really engaged with each other, and they're smiling and laughing, and even some maybe some gentle humor yet self-deprecation, and they're not necessarily interrupting each other, but instead they're kind of completing each other's sentences. And I can think of some examples where I've seen that. Hopefully you too. On the flip side, I can certainly think of some situations where I've witnessed a couple tell a story and it has been full of interruptions or irritations or instances of each other correcting, one person correcting the other person, right? So even if I didn't know what the people were saying, just by watching how they're saying the story, I can certainly learn a lot about the couples, right? So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about narrative interaction. Narrative coherence is also a part of the storytelling process. This has more to do with how the story gets told. Is it consistent? Does it make logical sense? Is there kind of a start, a middle, and end, right? Does the affect or the kind of emotion match the content of the story? If it's a funny story, are people reflecting of that and laughing? If it's a sad story, on the other hand, is it is the affect or emotion reflective of that? Right. So again, regardless of the content itself, just the narrative coherence just has to do with kind of the logical, consistent flow of the story. Now, some other things to kind of think about when it comes to storytellings within family. Gottman has another interesting study that looks at couples telling or talking about stories within their relationship. And in this particular study, what he's noticed is happy couples tend to simply remember more stories. Unhappy couples do not, on average, remember as many stories. And I encourage you to think a little bit about why would that be. It's possible that happy couples simply have more stories to remember, right? Maybe they have created more rituals and routines. Maybe they have had more interesting and novel experiences. And so maybe there just is a larger quantity of stories to actually remember. I think that's possible, but I don't know that that's the whole story, right? I also think that probably part of what's going on is happy couples simply want to remember and try to remember more positive interactions, right? And perhaps because it's kind of an interesting cycle. Because they are remembering more positive stories, they then are actually happier and more satisfied in their relationship, right? A number of studies suggest when couples are experiencing stress And when relationship problems are emerging, one really good thing the couple can do is to go back and to think about how they first met or the origins of the relationship. The argument there is that probably the early stages of the relationship were quite positive, right? And the feelings that each individual had towards their partner were really good, right? And so if couples can think back to those times that were really positive and where the sentiment was really good, that they can remind themselves of that. And so even though they may be dealing with stressors or problems currently, those positive feelings and all that goodwill can kind of come rushing back, or they can be reminded of that through the storytelling process. Okay. So as we have done with some of the other types of family discourse, like rituals and secrets, let's also take a look at family stories in terms of their functions or the purpose that family stories serve. There are a lot of reasons why family stories are important. They serve a lot of purposes. Right? Probably the first one that might come to your mind, the easiest one to think about, is this referential function. The referential function simply refers to the fact that stories help us remember events, right? They help us remember births and weddings and, courtships and all those types of things, right? So whether it is your grandparents telling you a story that you will go on to tell your grandchildren, or it's just simply a funny family story that comes up every Christmas, family stories absolutely help us to remember events, right, and remind us of things. There's kind of an interesting twist on this, but I think it would be kind of a neat thing to further investigate. Social media certainly plays a role in this, right? Whether it's Facebook or some other type of maybe more current form of social media, we often can use that platform to have memories be pulled up, right? And to add to our storylines, right? And so when those memories come up and we're able to review those, then it helps us remember events that we'd maybe forgotten about that had happened on that previous day years prior. Okay. In addition to the referential function, stories also serve this evaluative function. In other words, stories help us to interpret or judge events. Another way to say that might just simply be that stories help us to make sense out of events. I think one of the examples that I think of first when I think of this function is related to family events that were difficult or traumatic, right? Perhaps something like the loss of a loved one. Often stories, grief stories help us to kind of answer this question of why did something like this happen, right? Why did this traumatic event occur? We tell stories, retell stories, kind of have stories that evolve in order to help us answer questions like that. In order for us to try to make sense out of something that might not originally make much sense to us at all. Stories help us socialize members, so they serve this kind of socialization function. Again, I'm not so much talking about chatting or having conversation. I'm talking about the process of socialization, the process of teaching and learning values, manners, beliefs, and so on, right? For this one, I just have to go off on a little bit of a tangent because it's still so funny to me. But I had a student who shared an example during class a few years back about how her parents first met, right? So her parents had shared their courtship story with her, and she always thought that was kind of nice. It just was like a kind of classic boy meets girl in a small town type of story, right? I think she explained that she was told that they met during like homeroom, and her dad thought her mom was cute, and there was like a homecoming dance coming up, and so on, right? Well, so you're thinking, well, that's not so funny or interesting. Well, it becomes quite funny when it turns out that the real story was really, really different. And the real story came out on the student's 21st birthday. The family, I think, was actually all celebrating together. But so the real story comes out. And so apparently what really happened was the mom had gone out with some girlfriends to a bar. Don't think she was 21 yet, but it was a small town, so she was able to kind of sneak right in. she got overserved, and all of her friends somehow disappeared on her. So she was intoxicated, and she was at this bar, and my student's future dad happened to be working at the bar and kind of knew of her, and knew that she would get in a great deal of trouble if she went home in the state that she was, and obviously was also just concerned about getting her home. So the student's future dad helped future mom get home. They snuck up like the back of ladder and everything of the house and got her all set. And so that was really how they met. The relationship formed from there. And I think that's kind of such an interesting example for this socialization function, right? Why didn't her parents just tell her the real story from the get-go? I think there's probably some obvious reasons for that, right? I don't think parents wanted to pass down these values that it's a good idea to break these rules, to meet someone at a bar when you're already intoxicated, to go home with someone you don't know. Obviously, those are not the types of behaviors that the parents were hoping to teach their daughter, right? So all this time they concocted this kind of made up version of the story to instead convey behaviors and values that they thought they did want to pass down. Okay, so all right, that's the socialization function. Stories also serve the belonging function, right? I think it's really interesting when you think about how stories can do that, right? But really, they really can, right? If you are in on the story, if whether that is because you are a part of the stories and you're involved in the actual story itself, or if it's when you get to kind of have the rights to that story and you all of a sudden get to share that story. In both ways, stories can kind of bring people into the group or kind of exclude people from the group. And I think one of the most interesting ways to think about that is maybe with new romantic partners, right? If any of you happen to be in romantic relationships right now, and maybe some of those relationships are just starting, or maybe you've been with your romantic partner for a while, it's interesting to think about how during that courtship time you have maybe been introduced to some of the family stories, and yet on the other hand, maybe there are still some family stories that you aren't aware of yet. So thinking about kind of when are you in enough, part of the inner circle enough to get to start to hear the stories that you get to hear. And then at what point do you now kind of feel like some ownership of the story? And you maybe even get to be, one who kind of tells the story. So, thinking about all those different kind of ways in which stories, not only their content, but also who tells them, is a way to think about how stories can really enhance feelings of belonging. And the last function there that's listed is the idea that stories can connect generations. Certainly stories can do that. There have been all kinds of interesting projects that you can find on the internet regarding the passing down of stories among generations. So absolutely, stories can serve that purpose. Okay, as we kind of wrap things up for this particular lecture, I wanted you to just take a look at this video. It's just like 4 or 5 minutes, but it is a video that has compiled the story of how a handful of real couples say they first met, right? And so you can see here that both individuals in the couple are included in the storytelling. The video does do some editing and some like cutting and pasting for us, so we don't get to see them telling the story at the exact same time throughout the whole course of the video, but there is some of that as well. So, having read the chapter and now having listened to these lecture slides, I want you to just take a look at this video and examine the narrative interaction and the negative coherent, excuse me, let me try that again. Examine the narrative interaction and the narrative coherence. Right, think about whether you're seeing examples of engagement and turn taking and warmth, or I don't know, do you see any examples of interruptions and contradictions or anything like that? Right, so I think you can get some interesting insight by watching by watching how these couples tell the story. So I'm gonna go ahead and play the video for you, and then once it's done, this lecture will be finished.